everybody, and welcome to the latest CTO Craft Bytes event. Today we are joined by Ahmad, who's the founder and CEO of EmployAbility. If this is your first time at a CTO Craft Bytes, let me tell you a little bit more about the group. CTO Craft is a mentoring and learning community for technology leaders all around the world. Focused on supporting our members in leadership growth. The community has tens of thousands of members, and CTO Craft provides them with coaching, mentoring circles, a curated Slack community, international conferences, and events just like this one. If you're not a member of the CTO Craft community and are interested in becoming one, or you'd like to get updates on events, on emails, there are some links over in the chat to help you do just that. Yes, they are there. I can see. Thank you. Huge thanks today to CTO Craft's sponsor partners for helping make these Bytes events possible. Partners like AWS, Google Cloud, O'Reilly, and Pentalog, amongst others. CTO Craft membership gives you access to some unique benefits from some of these partners. So click the links in the chat and find out more. My name's Emma Hopkinson-Spark. I am Chief of Staff at 101 Ways, and I'm joined today by Ahmad. Do you want to just tell people a little bit about yourself?
Sure, thanks very much, Emma. I'm I'm the CEO of EmployAbility, set up in 2006, and our mission is to create equity and inclusion in the workplace for neurodivergence and disability.
Thanks, Tab. Those of you that have been to one of these before will know the Crowdcast platform. You'll also notice the fact that it's changed quite a lot in the last few months. But over on the right, you will see a chat window where those links are. By all means, say hello, post your own contact details and things so that we can all start to network and connect together. If you do want to ask any questions of Tab as we go through, just below that little chat sign, there is a question mark with Q&A. That's where the best place to go pop any questions in there, and I will feed them into our conversations as we go. Right, we'll kick in then. So, Tab, we're talking about neurodivergence, disability, inclusive workplace, lots of really long buzzwords that everyone has heard lots about. I guess the one that really jumps out first I wanted to start with was this idea of inclusivity and how maybe that's not the same as just diversity or equality or equity. So yeah, what do we really mean by inclusivity in the workplace?
I guess inclusivity is all about how do we make people feel that they belong? How do we make people not feel not othered in how we treat them, how we talk to them, how we include them in the workplace, specifically talking about the workplace at this point. But of course, workplace is made up of our day-to-day work, but is also made up of our social life at work. And what sort of things do we do to make sure somebody feels a part of that and not different from other people in participating? So it's that feeling of, I think inclusivity is all about that feeling of belonging. And now there are many different things that might go towards creating that feeling of belonging. Obviously, things like are people able to do the work that they've been brought in to do? Do they have access to be able to do that? And access isn't always physical, so I know we can get into that later. In people's attitudes and so on, do they feel that they have the right attitudes from other people? Do they feel they have the right tools if they need anything specific to be able to do that? And then do they feel they can socially participate with that group of people? We're with people all day, every day, and we're at work. I know where some people work remotely these days, but nonetheless, we're part of teams, we're part of groups within organisations. So how do we make everybody feel that they belong and they can properly participate? So for me, I think that's inclusivity.
Okay, and it's, I mean, okay, I'm over the age of 30, over the age of 40, nearly 50. And certainly years ago, it wasn't talked about. I mean, when I started my career and started working in offices, I don't think the word was ever used. So there must be a real trend in recent years towards that as well. So yeah, how have you seen things shift in attitudes?
Yeah, I suppose, I guess what you're talking about is diversity was used, right? How do we have diversity in the workplace? How do we have people that look different to us, are different to us in the workplace? How do we create that diverse workforce? So that's great. You can have people from different backgrounds, maybe ethnically different, maybe different genders, maybe people with different disabilities or neurodivergence or gender preferences or sexuality, whatever that looks like. But that's great, you can have all those people there, but how do you make them feel that they belong there, that they're part of the organization you've got? You know, I'm probably older than you, Emma, and I can remember in certain situations I spent a lot of my time working in the city, and I can remember certain situations where there were very, very few women. So, you know, the culture might be, well, you know, men met up to go to a golf course and women didn't do that. So that wasn't really belonging or inclusivity, that was just diversity, yes, but how to make people feel that they can participate and that they're not excluded from the ways in which people participate in the workplace.
There was one place I worked at where I wasn't just the only woman in the tech team, I was the only woman in the company. And I remember them telling me at the time how proud they were of the fact that because there was only one woman, they didn't even need a separate women's toilet. So everyone was so far ahead of their time, because now, of course, it's all gender. Yeah, it happened quite a lot. Okay, so we're specifically as well working into the neurodivergency and disability. Now, I know that disability in itself is just one of those protected characteristics under the law and how you treat people. And then I guess neurodivergence is a subset of that, or how does that all work together, and what do people need to know?
So I know we've got people joining from this side and the other side of the pond as well on this occasion. So yeah, both in most countries, most jurisdictions, in the UK, in the US, across many European countries, and in other parts of the world as well, there is sort of law around protecting people with disability or neurodivergence, and I'll explain the difference in a moment. And how, let's talk about the Equality Act here, and it's very similar with the ADA in the US. How does that define disability? Well, it defines it as a physical or mental impairment that has a substantial impact on someone's ability to carry out normal day-to-day activities, so not just in the workplace, normal day-to-day activities. If something's minor or trivial, it's not a disability, but if it has significant impact on day-to-day life, then it is. And then that has knock-on effects. Employers in the workplace are required by law to make adjustments, or in the US it's called accommodations, to ensure that somebody can effectively participate in getting work, but also in the workplace. The term neurodivergence, and it's a really wide definition before I go on for that, it's a really wide definition. So typically people think of somebody in a wheelchair, somebody with a physical, visible disability, but we know that over 70% of disabilities are non-visible. So what sorts of things are we talking about? Well, neurodivergence is one of them. Mental health conditions, numerous other health conditions, kidney conditions, heart conditions, whatever that looks like. Neurodivergence is a much newer term, coined just only in the last decade, I'd say, probably. And it covers things like autism, ADHD, Tourette's, dyslexia, dyspraxia, and so on. There's a lot of people within that group who may not self-identify as having a disability, and that's okay. People should self-identify however they want to, with whatever titles or tags, whatever they're comfortable with. I think the really important bit here, though, is to understand that however you self-identify is one thing, but to know that there are protections in law under the term disability, under that umbrella term. So neurodivergence for legal purposes certainly falls under disability and has the same protections, therefore.
So I guess there's a difference between being protected under the law from how you're treated in a workplace and how you get employed and everything else, versus creating a culture of inclusivity within the workplace, because I guess they're not quite the same thing, are they? So.
No, they're not the same thing. And when we're working, we work with some we have some global partnerships with organizations, so really large companies like AWS or Google, or various other small organizations too, and organizations also who have a global presence. And so laws are different in different countries too. What we advise is actually think about inclusion from the perspective of best practice beyond compliance. To do that, you have to know what compliance looks like first to make sure you get that right. But I think it's about, so we normally advise them to, when they're referencing disability, to also reference neurodivergence. So we'll often say disability and neurodivergence, because somebody might not self-identify with disability. And then I think there's something really important here to think about in terms of visible versus non-visible conditions or disabilities or neurodivergence, mental health, etc. Because if somebody has something visible, if you're in a wheelchair, and you're in the workplace, people can see that you're in a wheelchair, and therefore that may mean that people can understand better what accommodations or adjustments you might need. They should still be asking you, but it might be easier for them to process that versus if somebody has a non-visible condition, whether it's mental health or neurodivergence, it's much harder to know what is going to be helpful to that individual. Therefore, there need to be certain processes in place that enable that person to ask for the support that they need in a way that doesn't make them feel that there's a stigma attached to this.
Right. Okay. And what types of accommodations then do you normally recommend, or how can you help them? What are those accommodations?
I think a really important thing to understand is that there is no template for accommodations, right? So we often get asked, well, can't you just tell us, give us a list of disabilities and tell us what accommodations needed for those disabilities? It doesn't really work like that because it has to be individualized to the person in front of you. Yeah. But to give you some ideas, when people think of accommodations, they often think, well, it's a ramp or it's a door that's not too heavy, but that's just if there's physical accommodations needed, or it might be somebody needs a different size work screen or change their workstation, things like that. These days when we work from home, a lot of the time we can maybe make those accommodations for ourselves. But there can also be things like what we employability call attitudinal accommodations of perception. So, if somebody has autism and they don't necessarily participate socially in the way that you would expect them to, then maybe not holding that against them. If in a meeting they need to attend virtually, even though everybody else is attending in person, maybe allowing them to do that or have their camera switched off, for example, because that might really exacerbate their condition for them, and maybe then they can't participate effectively. Maybe breaking down tasks in a particular way. And I think what's really important here is I don't want to give the impression, because as an organization, we do not subscribe to this. This isn't about lowering the bar. This isn't about feeling sorry for people. This isn't about oh well, so and so's got neurodivergence, therefore we have to treat them with kid gloves. It's not about that. It's actually about creating, use the word earlier, equity in the workplace in order that somebody can effectively participate and bring their full selves, their full skills, what they're there to do as best they can equally to everybody else there.
It leads to an interesting question, and apologies if this gets it controversial, but I've literally had the conversation with people where I guess the needs of one and what they need to feel valuable and contributing and equitable versus the needs of somebody else who needs quite the opposite. As in, I've worked with people where they find it very difficult to have meetings remotely because they need the energy of others to be their best selves and be creative, and they find it very difficult to communicate when people have their cameras off. And how do you balance that then when there are some people that need one thing in order to be their best selves and somebody that needs quite the opposite to be their best selves as well? So how do you find that balance equitably in a workplace?
That's a really good question, and made really topical as well, Emma, by the pandemic, when literally overnight we all had to switch to working remotely, and we did globally. I think what that also made companies and individuals realize is that it's possible, right? It's possible. All those things that we assumed weren't possible to do remotely, sales meetings or whatever, technical meetings, whatever that might look like, we've suddenly realized, oh, it's possible actually, and maybe even for some people it's preferable. But I do take your point. I think for some people, being part of a team where they are with that team physically in the same room and can feed off each other's energy is really important. And for other people, they don't work best like that. They work better maybe on their own in a room, maybe at home, on their computer. But so I think we're all still, and I think many companies are still trying to figure out, what does that look like? What does that hybrid working environment look like? What happens, for example, if some people are in the office and you want to have a meeting, but not everybody's in the office? Maybe they're in a different global location. Maybe it's just not possible. Forget preference, right? But you want to include them in the meeting. So there's going to be some people joining remotely and there's going to be some people in the room. But maybe that's not equitable either, because the people in the room can interact with each other in ways that people who are joining remotely can't. So how do you solve that? Maybe, I don't know, maybe you require everybody, even the ones in the office, to join remotely. So that could create equity, for example. Or maybe you have, I don't know, maybe depending on what practical things are possible, maybe you have a once a month or once every few weeks, whatever that looks like, once every 3 months, in-person thing where everybody attends and other things are done remotely. So I think there's some mix of that we have to figure out, because you're right, you can't please all the people all the time. So maybe we have to find solutions, whereas I think previously it was just, no, it has to be in person.
Yeah.
Right. So I think what the pandemic has shown us, it doesn't have to be. And maybe we can have a lot of flexibility, and wow, technology allows us to do that. So, yeah, we're doing it right now, right? This wouldn't have been thought possible a few years ago in quite the same way. So I think it still needs to be figured out. I think what is important is that, however, even in however that looks like, there might still be some people due to disability or neurodivergence who simply can't participate in the expected way. And in that situation, an accommodation may be necessary because it's a legal duty as an employer to provide that accommodation for that specific individual. I think that's something different from, well, somebody just has a preference to do it this way.
Okay. And I guess that, you say you can't please everybody, and it's finding a solution to it that's the most equitable and fair across, and some balance in it. And I guess what strikes me as well, though, is sometimes people don't know what accommodations they would need. Like you say, that idea of like self-identifying, maybe they identify themselves as having some kind of neurodivergence, but they don't like the idea of being identified as disabled. I guess what comes with that sometimes is also, look, I don't like working this way, but I don't know what's going to help, or this is who I am, this is how I am, this is how I think and what I need, but they don't necessarily know what they're going to come to you with and say, actually, it would be better if I could join meetings remotely and have my camera off, as the example you gave. Maybe they don't know that. So I'm conscious that in our audience, we've got a mixture of people that are probably joining this conversation from a perspective of probably having some neurodivergence as well, or some accommodation needs in their company, but mostly from a leadership perspective as people in their team that maybe haven't identified themselves yet, or had that conversation, or don't know how they need to be treated, or don't know what accommodations they might need. So any advice, particularly from the leadership stance, as to how to approach that with their teams?
Yeah, I think it's really difficult for some people, right? It's difficult, to, there's a few different things going on. I think it's a complex space for that reason, right? So somebody may know they have a neurodivergence or disability, but not what accommodations they need exactly, as you said. So how do they go about figuring it? And they might not know what's available to them. They might not know what the company's willing to do. They might not know what the company's willing to provide either, right? So in terms of what to ask for, there's the kind of what to ask for, there's the how to ask for it. So, and maybe I know, but how do I go about that, right? And if, when, why to ask for it? There's all these kind of questions. And I think it can be quite difficult for people sometimes to know how to approach that if there aren't the right processes in the organization, if there isn't a culture that we've been talking about in the organization of doing that. So what's the process? Let's say I have a neurodivergence and I need some accommodation. Let's say I have ADHD. I need some accommodations. Maybe even if I sort of know what I need, or I'm not sure, but want to talk to somebody about it, who do I talk to in the organization? Who do I go to? And who will my information be shared with? Because I don't want everybody to know about it at this point. So what does that process actually look like? So from an organizational perspective, what processes do you have? How visible are they? How easy to use are they? How safe do they feel people to interact with in order to get the accommodations they need? That's the first step, because otherwise nobody's going to ask, even if they know what they need. Right. So there's that element. Then there's the element of knowing what you need. Well, yeah, I think it'd be quite hard. Sometimes it's a case of try a few things and see. We as an organization support individuals to understand what their needs might be, and then advocate those on their behalf to the employer. And so there are organizations out there who can support with what is needed, what might be helpful. a lot of it is about giving the individual confidence to feel comfortable to, in the first place, ask, and then helping them with the support of what is actually needed. Yeah, I mean, I can see somebody saying it's, there's a legal requirement. Absolutely, there is for the company to provide it. So, from a company perspective, if you could be in this country, in the UK, if you could be reasonably expected to know that somebody has a neurodivergence disability, you have a duty to investigate further in order that you as the company can understand what you are required to provide.
Okay.
So it's not just that the onus is on the individual,
okay.
right? And I think also, Emma, from the perspective of a company, forgetting the legality for a second, if you employ somebody, you want the best return on investment on that individual, right? You want them to perform to their best ability. If you're not doing all of those things, quite outside of even potentially breaking the law, you're probably not getting your best return on investment.
Yeah. Yes. And there is a question from the audience, actually, which I'll pop in now, and then I think we should move on to talking a little bit about hiring practices and how that might change as well. But before we do, there's a question from Mark saying if you have any suggestions of places in the UK that could test people for a range of neurodiversities, and it says ideally for free. I think Joe has also put up on the comments that suggesting the NHS and that reference to this BBC Panorama type investigation around some of the more questionable, shall we say, practices in private diagnoses. Yeah, do you have any experience of any of that? Sure.
I know that in the UK there are really long waiting lists for diagnosis, particularly for neurodivergence. There are private practitioners that can certainly diagnose. Of course, there's a Panorama thing about ADHD, but there are also some very good private practitioners who do the work properly, who give proper diagnoses. They are expensive. They're not free. And you still have to, with the good ones, you still have to get a slot to have that meeting for the, to go down the road of diagnosis. NHS waiting lists are long. Yes, it's not ideal. It's not ideal. However, from a company perspective, just because somebody doesn't have a legal diagnosis or doesn't have a diagnosis, doesn't mean you can't provide the accommodations, right? So diagnosis isn't the only route to accommodations, right? Somebody might know, though they might not have a diagnosis, of how they are impacted. And if they are impacted, then from a company perspective, it's really important that you have a conversation with that individual, make them feel comfortable to have that conversation so you can understand from them what their needs are. Now, I know, of course, from an organizational perspective, is there a cost attached to it? Is there, if somebody doesn't have a diagnosis, do I have to make that accommodation if I'm a company? Usually, the cost of accommodations is really, really minimal, because often it's to do with you as a manager, you as your team, what's your attitude, how are you going to incorporate that? Maybe it's just about working slightly differently with that individual, providing support in that way, providing understanding. And that may be what the person needs. Maybe it's providing information in a different way. So sometimes accommodations are really inexpensive, and they're not, people still think, oh, it's going to be really expensive. Somebody mentioned access to work in the chat, and I saw that. And access to work is a pot of government funding in the UK that is available to individuals to pay for the cost of accommodation. It's not always easy to get your hands on it, but it is a process. And whether or not somebody can get their hands on that, it's through the individual concerned. And of course, it benefits the company, because if there's a cost attached to it, maybe the company doesn't have to pay for access to work will. But if that isn't possible, the duty is still there for the organisation to make sure that they will provide support for reasonable accommodation. And without getting into what that means from a legal perspective, it's based on facts and circumstances. And most accommodations, you should assume, are going to be reasonable.
And I would imagine as well that, like you say, not all costs and not all accommodations, and probably I imagine most are not a physical, tangible, fiscal cost associated with it. It really is about changing the way that you work and you interact, and that culture of inclusivity. One of the things that kept jumping to mind as you were speaking was that the old adage of the cost of doing it versus the cost of not doing it. Because if you're not accommodating people, okay, so you make accommodations for people, and half of them are maybe not, have not got a diagnosis. What's the worst thing that happens? That you make accommodations for a bunch of people and they feel happier about it, and you have a more inclusive workplace. Whereas if you don't, then what you're doing is alienating a bunch of people and probably losing half your workforce.
Right. And just to kind of really to kind of put into, just using that to put it into an example that might make people sort of understand that, what that means. Let's say you get backache, right? You have a particular chair, you get backache, you're in the office every day or whatever, and it's not a disability, but it would make you feel a lot more comfortable if you could have a different chair, and you'd probably work better if you had a different chair, you wouldn't be in pain. And maybe by not giving it to you, if a company's resistant to that, you might end up with a disability. So it's a sort of, you might end up with something chronic, a chronic condition, which might then be deemed to be a disability. So I guess it's just about changing our thinking, and I think it is happening, right, in companies. And it's changing our thinking to what can we do as companies, as organizations, as team leaders to change our attitude towards if it's not really going to cost us that much. It might mean we have to do things slightly differently. It might mean we have to adapt our own behaviors a bit, but we can probably learn to do that. And it's going to make somebody else feel a lot more comfortable and enable them to be their best selves at work. Then why don't we do it?
There is a question as well asking on those private testers for diagnosis, if you do have any recommendations of ones that maybe have not been investigated by Panorama or something, then if there are any recommendations, then I think the audience would be good to hear it as well, if you can think of any.
I do. There's a particular clinic in London, depends where you're based. I'm in London, so and I'm familiar with this one because I've used it for, my older child has autism, for example, high functioning but has autism. So actually it's the EFRA clinic, EFFRA, and there's a lady there called Eleni Palia-Costa. I'll try and put that in the chat. I think that's how you spell it, but anyway, and you can certainly contact them, and they are very good, actually, very, very, very good. I've referred lots of people there, including friends, family, and professionally. They're very good. But they're also very popular. So
we're waiting on a referral from my daughter as well at the minute, so I might give them a call myself.
Yeah.
Okay, moving on then more to like hiring practices, and we've talked a lot about the kind of accommodations and changes you might want to make in the actual workplace. Well, how about through the hiring process then as well? How does that show up? What should we be looking for or trying to make more equitable?
I think the first thing is to make sure that you reference that you will make accommodations or adjustments in the process should somebody need that, and give them a mechanism to be able to reach out to ask for those. Because sometimes companies will say, oh, we're inclusive and we believe in equity and equality and we want to do all the right things, but then somebody actually applies and there's no mechanism for them to actually be able to reach out to somebody to ask for those accommodations. And I would say ask for the accommodations at every touch point that you have with that applicant, because sometimes people don't ask for it at part of the process, or might change their minds, ask for it later. Maybe they didn't need it earlier and need it later. So it depends what your recruitment process looks like, but ask at every touch point. Ask in a way that is in language that is not going to make somebody feel that they're fulfilling a legal duty. So ask in a friendly way. Ask in a way that's going to make somebody think, oh, actually they're asking because they want to be supportive rather than because they're going to discriminate against me.
Yeah.
So there's all these other things, and if you're doing anything internally within your teams, within the organization that is inclusive, so that you can really showcase, I say put that on your website, showcase it, talk about it, shout about it, internally and externally. And then make sure that you provide the accommodations needed. Make sure you might give some examples of the types of accommodations that you can provide, because people don't know. People think, oh, well, again, people might just be thinking, well, okay, it's only if I need particular software or certain screen size. So give examples for the recruitment process, what accommodations, types of, and it might be attitudinal accommodation. We won't hold it, we won't hold it against you if you don't make good eye contact, for example, if you have autism. So some examples of that. And we help with wording with that for companies as well. But I think the other important thing, particularly here in the UK, to note is that whilst, and it's the same in a lot of countries actually, is that whilst you can ask about accommodations needed for the recruitment process, you are not allowed to ask during the recruitment process any information about health conditions or disability. It's unlawful. Okay.
Right.
So it's really under Section 60 of the Equality Act. So it's really important, and I believe it's very similar in the US as well, and in many European countries. Do not ask any questions about, do you have a disability or neurodivergence or what it is? Do not ask for any evidence. You're not allowed to do that either. Okay, in order to provide the accommodations, simply provide the accommodations if you're able to provide, well, you're required to provide it, right? So it's unlikely you're going to be asked for something in recruitment that you just can't provide. So provide the accommodation being asked for. And you're also not allowed to take any of the information provided during recruitment to extrapolate that for what workplace accommodations may be needed. You can only have that conversation once you've made an offer. Now, once you make an offer, you are legally allowed to ask further questions about disability neurodivergence in order that you can provide the full extent of accommodations for the workplace. So the duty is far greater at that point to provide accommodations once somebody's an employee. And therefore, you're allowed to ask further questions, and you must in order to ensure that you're providing the full extent of accommodations needed for the workplace.
That's really interesting, and I imagine, in a practical sense, very difficult. So your conversation as an employer, and that's quite difficult to walk that line. And I can imagine there are quite a few employers, recruiters that fail to walk that line successfully.
There are many recruiters, employers who fall foul of that, and we have countless examples of. We support university students and graduates in their transition from education to employment. And we often hear from our students that they're being asked to provide evidence in the form of either the educational psychologist report or some medical evidence in order to get the accommodations. It's unlawful. We will often then step in and speak to the company in a nice way and say, you can't really be asking for this. But, it's really tricky if you're the individual concerned. Look, you want that job. You don't want to get on the wrong side of that employer. There's a huge power imbalance going on, particularly if you're young and it's your first job and so on, or even if you're not, right? There's a huge power imbalance going on. Really hard to negotiate that on your own behalf, or the recruiter saying, I need this to provide you with this. Often people either just give it, pass over sensitive health related information at that point, or they just don't ask at all because they're worried about doing that. Mm. So it's really important that if you're the company who's hiring, that you make that really clear, that you just ask about the accommodations. You're not asking anything else. You don't want to know what the person's disability is. Anyway, it's not very useful to know what somebody's disability, what the medical condition is. It doesn't tell you anything about the accommodations needed.
So flip it to the other side then. You say you talked about supporting students and going into their first jobs. And there will be people, I'm sure, on the call and listen back to this, that are in a position where they're looking for a job as well, or they're thinking of making a change. And maybe they feel like they would benefit from some accommodations. And so they're probably having those conversations from both sides, once as an employer, but then also as somebody that's looking for a job. What kind of advice can you give to people then? Do you find yourself in that position where it's a job you really want, you think you'd be awesome at it, and someone is asking for you for, well, what's your disability and have you really got this and can you prove this? Should that be a red flag to you about that organisation and what the future might be with them? Is it just that they're more likely to not understand that they're asking something they're not allowed to? What kind of advice can you give to those job seekers?
Well, it might be any of the above, really. It might be a red flag. You might not want to work for an organisation like that, or it might be just that you've got a recruiter who doesn't understand the law around this space, or they're not trying to do anything bad, but they just don't know that they're doing something they shouldn't be doing. I think in that situation, I think I would really clearly just state, I'm not, I will the accommodations I need are this. I won't be providing you with any information about my condition due to Section 60 of the Equality Act, right? Or you could just, and GDPR privacy rules. You can even say that, because there's actually also that, right? So it's not just the Equality Act. If you're providing that sort of information, where's the company holding it? Who's it being shared with? How long have they got it for? Have they got your consent? There's the whole GDPR, the whole mindful of GDPR considerations as well. So I think if you were to say, due to GDPR privacy rules and my protections, or not even protections, right? And you could just say that I'm not prepared to share that information. See, there's a way you can probably put it nicely without it sounding like you're being really difficult.
Like you say, you don't, and of course everyone knows that nobody would, but you don't want your card marked. You don't want to say you don't want to annoy people. Yeah, that sounds like a really tricky balance again to try and walk that line.
And I suppose, look, the second you ask for accommodations, the likelihood is that people are going to know you have a disability or neurodivergence, but they don't know what it is. Right. So if you feel like you've got something that you feel has stigma attached to it, maybe it's mental health or maybe it's a neurodivergence, they don't have to know what it is. Right? They don't have to know anything about it. And so it maybe takes away some of the worry about that disclosure piece. I also want to just say that historically, before Equality Act 2010, employers were allowed to ask you what your disability is in recruitment. Right? It changed in Equality Act 2010 because they felt that they didn't want discrimination to be taking place in the recruitment phase. So that's why a lot of employers are confused about this and don't actually know how to interpret that change. 13 years ago, but still it hasn't kind of caught up with some employers' understanding that bit of legislation. Yeah. But I think that so there was a lot of, and there still is, you'll get different people in this space who, and I feel really strongly about this, I'm going to just say it, who claim to be experts or feel they're experts because they have a condition, they have a neurodivergence or disability, whatever they have, who take this stance of, you should be open about your condition. You should talk about it. Bring your whole self to work. You should. This word should, I'm really uncomfortable with that word, right? Because ultimately, what you should and shouldn't do is up to you when it comes to your privacy. It must be your choice, right? The good news is you have a choice, because even if you don't want to talk about it, you can still get the accommodation, certainly recruitment, without talking about it. So I don't think there should be any should. I don't think people should feel under any pressure from anybody else to talk about something that's personal and private, that's about them, unless they want to, unless they're comfortable to. Now, in the workplace, employers are allowed to ask, but that's in order that they can provide the full extent of accommodations. But they're still not allowed to share that with whoever. It has to be done by an individual. GDPR privacy rules have to be respected, and so on and so forth.
So back to the role, I guess, of manager. So we've got people here that are managing teams, of which there will be some people that probably are neurodivergent and haven't asked for accommodations, and maybe they think maybe they're a manager who thinks, actually, I think I could do more, but these people aren't asking for it. Or maybe they're people that haven't identified yet, and all that mix, and trying to balance all that out. What kind of tips or advice can you give to those managers that really want to support their people and get the best out of them? How should they start those conversations with people that maybe haven't even raised it with them yet, or should they?
Well, I think if you're a manager or team leader and you've noticed that somebody is maybe finding elements or aspects of the work or interactions, or how they're able to deliver what's required of them may be difficult, or there's something unusual going on, then I would say have a conversation with that individual and say, look, and you don't have to say, look, I think you've got X, Y, Z, definitely don't do that. You might want to say, look, I've noticed that when we give information to you in this way, or I've noticed this element of your work being like this. Is there anything I can do to be supportive? Is there anything we can do to be supportive? Would it be helpful if we gave this information to you in this other way? I've actually supported managers to provide accommodations when the individual hasn't disclosed anything or asked for anything. So you as a manager can still make accommodations, right? Maybe you break tasks down into smaller bite-sized chunks. Maybe you check in with them more often about what they're doing. Maybe you make sure that the language used is explicit in what you want and isn't vague. Maybe you give some really clear written instructions that somebody can refer back to. Right? There's all these different things that you could do dependent upon how that particular individual is being impacted, and then check in with them maybe more often. But again, some of these things don't have to be onerous.
And I guess without needing to explicitly refer to it as accommodations or any kind of neurodivergent. I'm thinking of a particular, I have known people in the past who have had managers come to them and say, oh, you're clearly on the spectrum, let's do this. I'm like, wow, how's that for a diagnosis?
Don't do that. But equally, maybe, let's say if somebody is on the spectrum, don't hold against them that when they're talking to you, they're not making eye contact with you, right? Don't hold against them that when they're pitching, they're doing it in a particular way. Maybe support them to do it in a way. Don't say, oh, can you look at the camera? Don't say things like that.
But thinking, I guess, back to what does this individual need to be able to be their best selves, or to be supported, rather than what does this person have that I then have to go and counteract is the thing. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. Okay. Back to then the idea of hiring. I guess we do. you hear it talked about, don't you, this idea? And like you say, there's some people that are very, this is who I am, bring your whole self, you should talk about it, you should do this. And in that, you hear a definite narrative of that this is a superpower, that my neurodivergence is my superpower. What do you think that adds then to your team? We all know that we get the best, like even our product teams, the people are developing new software and tools and products. A diverse team makes the best products because they're representing so much more of society and can be part of it. And just look at even the innate racism in AI tools and things like that, and sexism that's coming through. There's got to be a lot more of that starting to see. But what do you think having that inclusive, particularly with that view of disability and neurodivergence, what does that do for your teams then when you can really enhance that and bring that to the table with a full team?
So look, I think you're right. I think having diverse teams, having inclusive teams where everybody can perform to their best ability certainly increases productivity, and that's been shown time and time again. And of course, we approach problems in different ways, and that's helpful. Is it a superpower? I personally, an individual might feel for them it is, right? And maybe, up to that individual. Some individuals would never want it differently because it makes them who they are. But everybody's experience is different. And I think when we use blanket things like this is a superpower, or this is, this isn't, or what, it doesn't sit well, because for some people, even if there's elements of it that feel like a superpower, there might be many other elements to it that are really exhausting, that mean that that person struggles maybe to feel exhausted at the end of a day because they've had to work really hard behind the scenes to communicate with people. Right? Maybe they've had to work really hard to process certain bits of information in a particular way that the world is designed for neurotypicals, not for neurodivergents, right? So in order to fit into that world in a particular way, people neurodivergent often do what's called masking, right? They behave in a neurotypical manner in order to fit into that world, but it's actually really hard work for some people to be able to do that. So I think somebody's experience of having neurodivergence in a neurotypical world, which is what our world is still going to potentially pose quite a lot of challenges for them. And even if elements of the way they are feel like a superpower to them, there might be many other elements that feel really, really difficult and exhausting for them, and they need support with that. So I think that we shouldn't, I'm not comfortable with superpower thing. Maybe somebody can feel that for themselves. That's great, right? But so even I remember the Olympics, and I went to the Olympics and the Paralympics when we hosted those in London, and those athletes were called sort of, I can't remember what they were called, but as if there was some sort of superstars and sort of amazing because they had a disability and they're performing. But what if you're somebody who, and that's great for those individuals, but what if you're somebody who's just a regular person who happens to have a neurodivergence, wants to show up to the workplace, do their work, go home? I don't think anybody with disability neurodivergence should be required to be superhuman in order to participate in society. Other people aren't necessarily required to be that. So, so I think there's those elements, and I think just make sure you're providing what that person needs to do whatever they do best and effectively. Yeah, and maybe the way that their neurodivergence affects them means for them, maybe they do some things more effectively than somebody else would do. That's great.
I remember a few years ago, and I can't for the life of me remember the name of the company now, but it was a consultancy that had set up exclusively hiring engineers with autism. That's how they pitched it into customers as well. And they pitched it as, look, we'll handle the accommodation of it. Yes, we need to treat this team differently, but what you get are out of the box thinkers, hyper focus on getting things done. The way that they used to talk about it was that it wasn't, oh, we feel sorry for these people and we're going to give them a job and we'll look after them. It's not a charitable thing. They hired them specifically because they were autistic and they knew how to handle that and accommodate that and to get the best out of them. But the only consultants they had working in the teams were those with autism. Just wondering on your thoughts on that, or how you see that as fitting in.
I think if you're an organization, you want to hire people to do whatever role that might happen to be, right? Whether that's in tech, whether that's for coders, whether that's for engineering teams, whether that's for creatives, whatever that's for. I would say that I think when we get into the realms of choosing people based upon things like neurodivergence or specific characteristics, then I think that's quite dangerous, because there's a couple of things that means. One, that if you happen to be within that group, let's say you have autism, but you don't want to be an engineer, then what, right? Because that organization is not opening up roles for you in anything else, because they only see you as fitting into that particular box, right? And so I just think, if you're an organization, instead make your processes, your culture equitable and inclusive, so that anybody with whatever condition, health condition, mental health condition, neurodivergence, disability, gender, whatever that looks like, sexuality, ethnic background, can join if they have the right skill set to join, right? And they're not going to find barriers in place because of that. So I prefer an environment which is much more focused, in a world which is much more focused on removing barriers, irrespective of difference, in order that somebody can showcase and demonstrate their abilities and their skills.
Good dog just started barking.
I think for me that's a preferable place to be, as opposed to you have this particular condition, therefore you can do this type of job.
It did feel weird at the time having that conversation with them, and it's like everything they spoke about sounded lovely, and I'm like, just doesn't sit quite right with me for some reason, and I can't quite put my finger on why.
And it's still going on, Emma. I'm not going to name the companies, but there are companies who are setting up specific autism programs. So yeah, there's kind of things that are in vogue. Well, the last few years it's been autism, now it's ADHD. So we kind of go through this kind of vogue disabilities or neurodivergence in vogue time periods in which there's a very big focus on just those particular conditions, but for very specific roles, which doesn't sit comfortably.
So we've got about 10 minutes left, by the way. If anybody does have any more specific questions on your circumstances, then do please pop them into the Q&A section. I guess I wanted to ask you more about looking forward as well, Tab. So we can see obviously how things have changed over, certainly in the length of our careers and over the last few years, and again since the pandemic. But where are we headed then? What's the future for this? Is it looking rosy? Is it all looking bright? Where are we headed?
I think there's still a lot of work to be done, but we've come a really long way too, right? I started working in this space in the early 2000s, and we've come a really long way. Disability and neurodivergence was on nobody's agenda back then. It was all about ethnicity and, gender, actually. So we've come a really long way. There is certainly better understanding, but I still think we've got a really long way to go as we start to talk about and answer some of these. It's still I'd say understanding around the space is still in its infancy, right? There's still a lot of work companies need to do in order to understand how to be supportive properly, how to make people comfortable to ask what's needed, how not to pigeonhole people because of their difference. I think ultimately we want to get to a place where organizations like us become redundant, right? We still exist. We still exist, and there's a real need for us still to exist in both supporting employers and organizations and companies to create those cultures of inclusion, those have the right policies and practices in place, and to understand what does best practice beyond compliance look like, right? To individuals who don't know how to ask what they need and who also need the support. So for me, we use a phrase at EmployAbility, I think I mentioned it to you earlier, called next generation inclusive thinking. And it's really about what can you do as a company to be that next generation inclusive employer? What can you do as individuals to kind of think inclusively about yourself, for yourself, and for others around you? And it's not just about words, and it's not just about phrases. I guess it's about, it comes down to educate yourself, educate your employees, educate your teams on what does inclusivity look like in a practical sense when it comes to practices and how you behave, what language you use, all of those sorts of things. And then it's the kind of, in what do you do that is inclusive? It's not just about saying that you're inclusive. So I'd say education, policies, practices, are really, really important if you want to create that culture of inclusion, if you want to be inclusive as an individual and as an employer or as a team leader.
If there's one thing I'm taking away, I guess, from our conversation is I'm thinking more and more in terms of the law side, the legal side, and your responsibilities as a guide on what not to do rather than what to do. So be mindful of the stuff that you shouldn't be doing. So and then everything else, it really just seems to be about treating individuals as individuals, regardless of whether they have any disability or neurodivergence or anything else. It's just, what does that individual need? And that way you're giving them what they need, regardless of how they've identified or how they've spoken to you about it. And then just say the law stuff is more about what not to do than it is what to do. Does that sound about right to you?
It absolutely does. Yeah. And don't judge people based upon your own preconceptions. Also, don't make assumptions, because people make assumptions about what accommodation somebody might need. People make assumptions about somebody's experience, about, don't make judgments. Ask the person, because usually they will know what some of those answers are. They might be worried about telling you, but they'll usually know. Ask them how you can be supportive. Ask them what you can do to be supportive. We've talked a lot about neurodivergence. We haven't, and I'm conscious of time, we haven't talked much about mental health, but obviously that's another huge issue, and particularly brought to light by impact of pandemic, actually, as well. It was already becoming a very important issue, and an even more important one now. And often an overlap, right? So these things don't exist in silos. Somebody with neurodivergence might also have a mental health condition, or somebody with another disability might also have a mental health condition. So I think it's also really important to think about what cultures you're creating that make people safe to ask for accommodation for mental health, because there is a stigma attached to that. People worry, right? People worry about, well, how will somebody view me? How will they think about me? Am I going to get the promotion I need? All of these sorts of things. So again, much like neurodivergence, it's a non-visible condition or disability, but you can provide support. You can provide those cultures or spaces of inclusion that mean that somebody feels safe to ask for what they need.
Do you have any examples or stories, anecdotes of where you? And I think you mentioned one to me when we were prepping this, around somebody that had applied for a job and gave some really flippant answer of oh, you should know this, or it should be evident, or anything like that. Have you any stories, any anecdotes that you can share people of your kind of experience?
Yeah, well, I mean, that particular one was about neurodivergence. There's somebody with autism who applied for. We partner with Google for a scholarship program we're running with Google, and I was screening the applications as many years ago, because I don't do a lot of that screening work anymore, but it does keep it real for me as well. But and I noticed they seemed like a really good candidate. They had the right skill sets. They were studying the right thing at university. They had loads of coding experience there. It was for a tech scholarship, and one of the competency questions, which was about sort of motivation, they'd actually written, they were being asked about why they're interested in getting the scholarship, and they'd written, well, I think it's obvious, or something like that, some words to that effect. And I thought, oh, okay, this is weird. It doesn't really fit with the rest of their application, but I did, on their application form, it did say they had autism. Now, just to clarify, we as an organisation were allowed to ask that question, and we still are, and we still do, because we are a disability organisation, a divergence organisation. We're not the employer. If we were, we couldn't ask that question. And the reason we ask it is that we can support the individual. Anyway, so I phoned the individual and I spoke to him, and he said, yeah, because by then I'd already answered loads of questions, I was doing loads of applications. I was too exhausted to actually answer that, and it should be obvious. So I was able to speak to him, give him some guidance around how to answer that question, because he was a really good applicant. He did then write it. He went on to be one of the winners of the scholarship, went on to do an internship at Google, and actually not even in the UK. He was based in the UK, but put himself well out of his comfort zone, did it in the Zurich office. And I'm still in contact with him, and he's gone on to do some amazing things, and now runs his own business. So there are success stories like that. But I could have been somebody who, I'm not saying I did him a massive favor or anything like that, but I might have been somebody, and it might have been normal for me to be somebody who'd have just gone, okay, well, I'm going to discard this person, so I've got hundreds of applicants to look through.
Happens every day.
And I missed out on somebody who actually was the right person. So I suppose the message in that is, if you're looking for the best people out there, are you looking for the widest possible pool of people? Or if somebody's profile looks a bit different, are you discounting them when they might be just the applicant that you're looking for?
I'm pulling that back again to just in the last few minutes around mental health as well, then, is I guess it's harder to see. Maybe it's temporary as well, and then it's something that somebody's just going through in the moment. There's a big move, obviously, the last few years. Mental health, first aid, England, very active and get lots of people. How does that all fit into that landscape? It's harder to tell, I guess, if somebody with depression or bipolar or whatever else is going on, that doesn't crop up. I can't see that cropping up in certainly in recruitment conversations, or maybe it's harder to identify that and to work with somebody as well.
So a couple of things. I mean, first of all, from a legal perspective, just let's go back to that for a second. If you have something temporary, let's say you've had a family bereavement and you're really upset, understandably, and you have depression for a month, 2 months, 3 months, but then you make a full recovery. And that, under the Equality Act UK, certainly is not deemed to be a disability. But it has to be something that is likely to last for 1 year or more. So in contrast to that, though, if you get cyclical depression, you don't have it every single minute of the day, 24/7, anything like that, but you're prone to getting it and it's present year in, year out, that is deemed to be a disability. So there is a difference in the definition of something temporary and something that's ongoing. In recruitment, of course, you wouldn't bring up the condition, but somebody could still ask for accommodation. So sometimes if somebody has a mental health disability, let's call it that, it might be that it takes them longer to process the question and formulate that answer. So one of the accommodations they might ask for is extra time for doing that, for not to be held against them that they're doing that. That can apply to neurodivergence as well, actually. It might be that they prefer, sometimes people ask for questions 10-15 minutes ahead of time so they can read them, process them, and then answer them it's not so they can prep them. That's not the reason for it. It might be they don't make good eye contact, or the tone of their voice, it doesn't change. Maybe they talk in a monotone, maybe they talk quietly, maybe they don't look at you. Again, don't hold that against them.
Right. So very similar, I guess, accommodations, regardless of then what they're bringing up.
Absolutely.
The way that you treat them is still, not holding it against them and treating them as individuals and bringing and allowing them to allowing yourself to see past that. And again, back to the legal thing is what not to do, rather than what to do. And actually, if your aim is to build an inclusive workplace, then what does it matter whether it's covered under the DDA or not? I suppose.
Right, and maybe they're having a bad day. Maybe that's why they're not looking at you, or maybe they have been excited about that interview, but at the last minute, due to mental health, they request for it to be moved to a different day. Now, if you can accommodate that, if you're not having to make a decision that day on the hiring, then do it, but don't hold it against them.
I feel like we could talk all day, to be honest. It's fascinating. Right, we are going to have to wrap up, though. We are at time. Is there any final thoughts from you, just as I post in links and things? Is there anything else you'd like to share with people?
Is there any final thoughts? Look, I'd say that if you're a team leader who's listening today, think about how you can be inclusive, think about what you can do to create that culture. And if you're not sure how to that, please reach out to us. It's what we do. We support organizations to do exactly that, to build those inclusive cultures, and also provide the education pieces as well. I know that my LinkedIn profile has gone up there, and I think our website address maybe can go up there as well. So please do feel free to reach out. I'll put my email address in here as well, so that if you want to reach out to me directly, please feel free to do that. If you want to have any conversations, either because you feel you might need accommodations, or because you're a manager of somebody who you think might need accommodations, you can reach out to me through my email address. Been great to speak. I don't know if anybody's got any questions, or I don't know if we're just at time now.
I think we're just about at time, but carry on the conversation. I would encourage you afterwards, and connect on LinkedIn. We can always pass questions and things on Slack as well, but any other comments or questions, let us know and we will pick them up. So I will say, yes, make sure you do connect with the speaker after the event. There are links in the chat, so thank you all for joining. The next event in the diary for everybody is happening on Thursday the 13th of July, which is an in-person panel event taking place in London. In partnership with Quantum Black, we've organised a panel discussion on diversity with AI machines aren't biased, people are, it says. Areas of conversation will include how AI could affect diversity in hiring pipeline and retention, how we could make sure that AI tools complement your current tool stack, how can we efficiently use AI tools without making any unconscious bias programmed into them. The event page for that is going to be posted into the chat, and we shall see you there. Tab, thank you very, very much for joining us today. Fascinating conversation, and I look forward to catching up with you soon. Thanks, everybody. Let's say goodbye. Thank you.